Welcome to today's lecture, the second in our series of 3 about the experimental method. Today's lecture is based on the College Board's outline for AP Psychology, topic 1.3, the experimental method. In today's lecture, we'll be focusing on how research drives the reasonable conclusions that we can draw. My name is Chris Gall, and I wrote today's lecture. Over the course of today's lecture, please feel free to pause the video or to rewind and rewatch parts of the video if you need to in order to understand the topic better. The learning target for today's lecture is that you should be able to describe how research designs reasonable conclusions that can be drawn. In English, what you need to be able to do is to explain how the decisions that a scientist makes when they design an experiment limit or expand what conclusions can reasonably be drawn based on the results of that experiment. To do this, we'll be looking at how experiments can be useful in determining cause and effect, the ways in which controls on experiments reduce the possible alternative explanations. In this sense, this lecture is a continuation of the previous one. How we can use random assignment to demonstrate cause and effect, and that correlational research can indicate if there's a relationship or association between two variables, but cannot demonstrate cause and effect. And in this sense is a continuation of our second series of lectures when we talked about research methods. There are a couple of key points to understand when we talk about experiments and correlational studies. The first is a reminder of some basic definitions. Experiments are used to determine a specific type of relationship, namely cause and effect. The whole point is to determine if the relationship is one of cause and effect. What happens to variable y when I change variable x, if we want to put it into algebra speak? Correlational studies are used to determine if a relationship exists at all. It does not speak to what that relationship is, which is to say that if x changes y or if y changes x. What correlational studies can do is tell you if it's a strong relationship or a weak relationship between the two variables, and if that is a direct relationship, that is to say when the value of x goes up, so does y, or an inverse relationship, when x goes up, then y goes down. The strength of the relationship is expressed using a correlation coefficient. That is a value between -1 and +1. The closer to 1, either positive or negative, the stronger the relationship. Positive numbers talk about direct relationships, negative numbers represent inverse ones. We'll talk more about correlation coefficients in a subsequent lecture. The important thing to know is that correlation studies do not express causal relationships. That is the second key point about experiments versus correlation studies. Another way of saying this is that correlation studies can tell if two variables are associated with each other, and they can be used to decide if an experiment is justified. If you think back to the previous lecture, controlled variables are those things that the scientist is not interested in studying, so they try to keep some kind of control of. If you've ever designed an experiment, you've undoubtedly worked with experimental controls. For biologists, they might be things like the type of nutrient a plant or animal gets, its food, or the conditions in which it lives, the amount of light or the temperature of the room. For chemists, it might be the rate of increase or decrease in adding chemicals or changing the temperature. For psychologists, experimental controls follow a similar idea. We want them to be the same for everyone. The most important thing is that the scientist doesn't want to study those variables that are being controlled. That the scientists, for lack of a better term, just don't care about them. And because they don't care about them, the scientists try to make sure that they never change and that they are the same all the time so that they can ignore them. In a psychological experiment, that might mean using the same questions for every group or doing the experiment at the same time every day. Really, any variable can be a control variable so long as it is kept constant so that its effect on the outcome can be minimized or ignored. Random assignment occurs when everyone in a group has an equal likelihood of being in either the experimental group or the control group. The experimental group is the group subjected to the experimental condition. The control group gets subjected to normal conditions, or whatever it is the experimental group is being subjected to. Whatever it is that, the control group gets subjected to normal conditions, or basically whatever it is the experimental group is being compared to. In order to ensure that a person or an animal has an equal likelihood of being in both groups, it needs to be truly random, something like a coin flip or pulling names out of a hat. Doing this minimizes the risk of any given difference between the groups. In other words, it makes them as similar as possible. This is another way of controlling variables, and a particularly effective way of doing it at that. It's worth noting that random assignment works best with bigger groups. In a group of 2, there's always large differences between the subjects, but with larger groups, those differences average out when subjects are randomly assigned. The topic of today's lecture was how experimental design drives the reasonable conclusions that can be drawn. To understand if you know this, ask yourself if you understand that you would use an experiment to determine if there's a cause and effect relationship between two variables. Then make sure that you understand that correlation studies cannot be used to determine if that specific type of relationship exists, cause and effect, only if there is a relationship and how strong the relationship is and whether or not it's a direct relationship, as one goes up, so does the other, or an inverse relationship, as one goes up, the other goes down. Say it again with me. Correlation is not causation. You also successfully understood today's lecture if you know that scientists use experimental controls in order to minimize the number of potential reasons for the relationship they're seeing. One of the best ways to control variables in an experiment is to use random assignment. In so doing, scientists minimize the difference between the experimental group and the control group and minimize the possible explanations. If you have questions about today's lecture, feel free to bring them into class and post them to me. Again, if you do not understand any part of today's lecture or feel like you missed something, please go back and watch all or part of the video. Otherwise, I will see you the next time class meets. Until then, auf Wiedersehen and good night.